And it's Friday, 25th of July, 2025. This week in the news, in Parliament, the four morons who collectively make up the One Neuron Party turn their back on the Indigenous population of Australia. Meanwhile, also in Parliament, the Australian government turns its back on the Indigenous population of Gaza, proving once again that talking about genocide is apparently far worse than actually committing it. Speaking of far worse, over in America, Australia's most respected and revered politician since Sir Les Patterson is encouraging the US government to build a naval base in Australia. You might want to run that one by the Australian people first, Scotty, before you pass all of our sovereignty over to the United States. All that and more in this week's Friday News Review. Okay, so welcome to the program. First off, we're going to talk about One Neuron and the joy that they bring to Parliament. You know, I often think the only people dumber than those four senators from the One Neuron Party are the people who actually voted for them. And I often wonder, do you know we all have those little dark secrets that maybe after one or too many shandies at a party you slip out, like, you know, that one time I was in Thailand. I often wonder if people who vote for parties like One Neuron or Barnaby Joyce, you know, Buy Me a Beer Joyce, I wonder if people, you know, it's the same kind of little dark secret that, you know, that people are talking at parties about politics and you mention, oh, well, there was that one time I was pretty wasted and I voted for Buy Me a Beer Joyce, or, you know, I went in the polling booth, I'd had a little snort, I was off my face, man, I came out and was like waking up after a big night out in the town. My God, what have I done? I think I voted for Pauline. Pauline Hanson, okay, is stupid. Remember a while ago, she was on a parliamentary inquiry. This is a bit that amazes me. A woman of her intellect put on a parliamentary inquiry looking into the AUKUS and the purchase of nuclear submarines. And I felt sorry for the Admiral. I don't know, was it Chris Barry, one of the admirals who was head of the Navy at the time? And you could see him internally shaking his head, although he had to remain professional and polite, you know, in this senatorial inquiry, being grilled by Pauline Hanson, because she couldn't comprehend how a submarine works. She didn't understand the difference between a nuclear-powered and a conventional submarine, and actually asked the Admiral, this is a true question, she actually asked, can the conventional submarine go underwater? That's why they call them submarines, Pauline, because they submerge, they go underwater. But I mean, that's the stupidity of this woman. Then you've got her offsider, Malcolm Roberts. That guy, I've got to admit, there's a genuine, I don't know if it's jealousy. Yeah, it's probably jealousy. I tried to get into Parliament and ran an election and found it's very, very hard. And I failed. Hands up, I didn't succeed. And I look at Malcolm Roberts and I think, he got in? He beat me? Oh, Bintang. That's not a good sign. You're going down in the world. Malcolm Roberts is one step out of a loony bin. The guy is a nut. If you recall, many years ago, he was on a debate on ABC TV with Professor Brian Cox. Now there is a David and Goliath struggle, if ever there was one. The towering intellect of Malcolm Roberts against the knowledge of Professor Brian Cox. And of course, Malcolm Roberts showed his absolute stupidity. They were talking about climate change and Professor Cox had a graph. Now we all remember school, the X and the Y axes, not really the hardest part of mathematics that we ever studied. Okay, but Malcolm had trouble with that because in the graph, Brian Cox was showing how the Earth's climate had been warming over a period of time. And poor old Malcolm was confused because the graph went up, down, and that told him that it wasn't really warming because there was periods when it went down. I've got news for you, Malcolm. It's this simple. On the y-axis, when you start here and you end up here, doesn't matter what happens in between, it's an increase. Okay, that is how basic it is, and that is the sort of technical information that Malcolm Roberts couldn't get his head around. These are the people who are making decisions. Now, I want to relate them, sadly, to what happened to Senator Faruqi. Now, as you know in the show, I call a spade, and at times I've been critical of Senator Faruqi. I think she mucked up the question I wrote for her to put to Penny Neverwong regarding UNRWA, which we'll talk about in a second. But credit where credit's due. She represents a portion of the Australian populace, and people have voted for her, and she represents their viewpoints, and her role is to go into Parliament and represent those viewpoints to the Parliament and to be a voice of the Australian people in Australia's democracy. When we have a situation where senators or any member of Parliament is being censured for expressing a view, okay, not a political stunt, she didn't carry on, she just had a sign talking about genocide, by the way. Quite a reasonable thing to express a viewpoint that I think, we here at the Winston Smith Project think that genocide should be discussed when it happens. So she's censured for that, okay? If that's the case, we don't have a functioning parliamentary democracy, we have a dictatorship. Because when you start stopping opposition figures from saying things you don't like, such as like people like Zelensky has done in Ukraine, you move from being a democracy to being a dictatorship. And what happened to Faruqi was disgraceful. The fact that she was censured and she has been banned from being part of any overseas parliamentary delegations. Says who? The Australian people elected her. Now, whether you agree with her or disagree with her, and I would say the same thing for those nutters in the One Neuron Party, by the way, they have a right to be part of parliamentary delegations as much as I think they're an embarrassment to the country because they were elected there by people. Perhaps very stupid people, but unfortunately society's full of those. Remember, Bintang's first law, most people are stupid. But all jokes aside, the banning of Faruqi from being in parliamentary delegations, to my mind, is a travesty. It's trampling on our democracy. Now, people might say, oh, she held up a sign, it wasn't appropriate. If you recall, Pauline Hanson came into Parliament and had a scarf with the Star of David wrapped around to promote her, you could say her support of genocide. But the point is, that was the flag of a foreign government. Now, she was in Parliament representing a foreign government. She's supposed to represent the Australian people and the Australian government. So why wasn't that a big issue? She also came into Parliament wearing a complete headdress, a complete full-on burqa, the whole bit, to try and make mockery of Islamic religious clothing. Why wasn't that such a big issue? Yet Mehreen Faruqi holds up a sign, says nothing, doesn't carry on, that just talks about starving children. She's representing the views of Australian people regarding the genocide that's going on in Gaza, and she's censured? That's disgusting. That is disgusting. And once again, as we say often here at the Winston Smith Project, it now appears that talking about killing is far worse than actually doing it. Protesting genocide is worse than committing genocide. And the question I have, especially given in mind now that we now know that the latest figure is that 17,000 children have been killed in Gaza. Okay? Let's just think about that, 17,000 children. And I personally believe the figures are going to be a lot higher because there are huge areas of demolished buildings and cities that the Israelis are not allowing people to go in. And we know the Israelis now have a clear and proven history of burying people in mass graves to hide their crimes. So I think the figures for the death toll of civilians in Gaza will be far greater than what we're being told. But let's go that we know that 17,000 children is a minimum. That's quite disgusting. I used to often think how the Germans survived or how they dealt with themselves, their conscience, during the Second World War when they saw millions of people being shipped off to concentration camps to be slaughtered, to be brutalized, to be executed, gassed, burnt, shot, etc. The average German citizens turned a blind eye to that. And for the first time in my life, I understand how that must have felt, because I'm in the same boat. We are collectively turning a blind eye. We're sitting here while a genocide, no different to what happened during the Second World War, no different to the Holocaust, an ethnic cleansing campaign involving deliberate genocide is going on, and we do nothing. Now, why is it that Penny Wong, who, remember, old Penny Neverwong was so quick to stop funding to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, when the Israeli government accused it of harbouring terrorists who'd taken part in the October attack. Now, straight away, Penny Neverwong cancelled funding straight like that. Why has it taken her so long to speak out about genocide? And even then, in the most vague terms, the most frightened, meek, gutless terms. She was so quick to act when Israel accused UNRWA of employing Palestinian terrorists. And yet, when Israel has gone on and demonstrably tried to eradicate an entire collective of people, and she seems a bit slower this time round to act. I don't see the same, razor sharp, decision making. It's all a bit vague, isn't it, Penny? You're a disgrace. The Labor Party's a disgrace. We knew the Liberal National Party was always a disgrace, but the Labor Party, they have annihilated their faith in their voter base, because people are disgusted with what we thought were people who would stand up for justice and decency, and who, of course, have been slaves to the Israeli lobby. Marine Faruqi is censured in Parliament. Well, no one voted for that, no one agreed with it. And yet, we also have a South African right-wing supremacist, racist, Nazi-loving Zionist who's now on $400,000 a year to actually tell us that what people like Marine Faruqi are doing is a crime, and to try and get it criminalised. That's how sad it's got. Labor and Liberal have collectively colluded, to silence dissent on genocide. Just let that sink in for a moment. Labor and Liberal colluded. And remember, if you remember several episodes ago, I talked about the group Advance Australia, which, our resident minister for special envoy for Israel, we'll call her, Gillian Segal, her husband donated money for. And I talked about how Labor and Liberal members colluded to fund and support Advance Australia as part of an anti-Palestinian, as a pro-Zionist movement. So we should be concerned about that. What's happened in Israel of late is that Knesset recently had a vote, and they voted 71-13, a non-binding resolution, but they voted 71-13 to annex the West Bank because, and I'll quote, they view that as an inseparable part of the land of Israel. No, guys, it's actually an inseparable part of the land of Palestine. The West Bank is Palestine, even under the appalling situation where we've given the majority of the country to a bunch of colonial racist neo-Nazi settlers. The West Bank was always still to be Palestine, and now the Israelis are saying, no, it's an undeniable part of Israel. Because this shows you how the Israeli mentality is, how the Zionists think, and they want to conquer the entire region. And after Gaza's gone, and after the West Bank's gone, don't think they're going to stop there. They're moving further afield, which is why recently they're involved in bombing Syria, why they have troops now in Syria. They've taken part of Syria, like they've taken part of every other country that's around them. Do you think that's ever going to come back? This is only the beginning. And our stupid, stupid government is supporting it. Disgraceful. Anyway, moving on to the third story of the week, which of course is our favourite politician, that empty, hollow shell of a human being, Scott Morrison. Sad. I actually went to school with Scott and his brother Alan. His brother Alan is a very nice guy, totally different to Scotty, very reserved man, very quiet background kind of guy. We talk, there's a little bit of underlying tension because, of course, he's not entirely happy with everything I've said about his brother. But Scott is a disgraceful human being. Now, he's over in America, and as I like to call him, the Minister for Raytheon. What he's doing addressing the US Congress is anyone's guess. He doesn't represent Australia. He doesn't represent this country. He did once, very badly. And if you recall, as a result of Scotty's, like bull in a china shop approach, China imposed sanctions. We lost $20 billion of trade with China, which Albanese has recently, to his credit, gone over to the Chinese and ensured we got our trade back on an even footing. But Scott's over there drumming up fear for a US-China war, and that we're missing the boat. We should be at these Chinese. We've got to be at them all the time. And as you recall, last week I talked about what a joke that is. Now, Scotty, as we know, was never a fan of democracy. Was never big on his agenda. In fact, he seemed, whilst he was the Prime Minister, he seemed to find it a bit of an encumbrance that there was a democratic system that he had to pretend to adhere to. But he's over there telling America that the US Navy should build a joint base here in Australia. I think it's extremely concerning. I think it's disgraceful that we've got US troops based in Darwin, that we've built at our expense runways for their B-2 bombers. Tucker Carlson, who's a bit out there, and once again, like I said, I call it as I see it. When people say things that are bad, they're bad. When people say things that make sense, they make sense. Tucker Carlson made a very good point. He said, in my country, he said, when we have foreign troops based in my country, he said, we don't call that an ally, a treaty, or cooperation. We call it an invasion. And it's a very good point. Why do we have any American facilities in this country? We're a sovereign nation. We don't need American troops based here. We don't need American bombers based here. And we certainly don't need American ships based here. And as you know, the Albanese government is shelling out huge sums of your money for this so-called awkward defence pact. And this week, ironically, I walked down George Street in the city yesterday, believe it or not, and I saw one of the most amazing things, the Queen Victoria building, a building full of designer label brands, Hermes, Jimmy Choo, brands, many brands I can neither pronounce nor know what they sell, but I just know they're expensive, Coach and the like. So this building that's selling $10,000 handbags, outside were people sleeping in the street. On the same day that our government, without any discussion by us, handed $800 million to the US government for its shipbuilding industry. So far, we've handed almost $1.6 billion to the United States and Great Britain to their shipbuilding industries, to provide welfare for them so that their workers can be employed in shipbuilding industries to improve their shipbuilding. Nothing to do with us, with no guarantee that anything being built there will actually ever come to us, because there's no clause in AUKUS that says they have to provide these submarines. We throw money at them. I've never seen a contract like this in my life. We throw money at them with no guarantee of getting anything back. And in the same day that we just handed over a $200 million payment, I'm looking at people sleeping on the street outside the Queen Victoria building. This massive juxtaposition of incredible wealth and poverty, and asking, why isn't that money being spent on welfare here? Imagine what $200 million would do. Imagine what $1.6 billion would do to the welfare budget that we've spent already on nothing. Ridiculous. And if you look at the policy or the mentality and the cost, Trump recently announced he's going to resume funding, sending weapons to Ukraine. Remember the guy who said he'd end that war within days? At one point even said he'd end it before he actually got into office. Well, now he's ending it by sending more weapons to Ukraine. I mean, petrol, fire, anyone? But then again, that is American policy. If you recall, we stopped terrorism in Syria by sending weapons to terrorists. But of course, they were moderate terrorists. And I guess Zelensky falls into that category, actually, if you know anything about the man and his policies and what's going on in Ukraine. So here, once again, the United States is taking sides in a conflict while standing back, showering weapons, which is only prolonging the conflict, only increasing the death toll, rather than attempting to mediate it, because, of course, they couldn't, it all got too hard, and poor old Donnie stepped back and scratched his head. As always, every day is a new day for Donnie. It's a different policy, different thought. And now he wants to send 17 Patriot missile batteries to Europe, which apparently they're going to pay for. You see, you can see why Donnie and Scott Morrison get on so well, because they just love making statements without consulting the people that they're making statements on behalf of. You know, Scotty's over there telling the Americans to come and build a base here without checking with us. Donnie's just told Europe that they're going to pay for 17 Patriot batteries without actually running it by the Europeans. And this is an interesting stat. And it came out from, I don't know if you know, General Christian Freuding. Mate, if you look at this guy, you can just see him standing on the top of a Panzer tank going, Kursk is that way, Be careful, Christian. Your forebearers tried running tanks into Russia and it didn't end too well for them. But he makes a good point. These Patriot missile batteries are being sent to help Ukraine fight drones. You see, we still don't understand the nature of warfare in the West. We're still trying to fight traditional wars and tanks and, planes and people marching across great open ground. Drones have changed everything. Now, this is from Christian Freuding. He said that the average Russian drone costs 30 to 50,000 euros to produce. And as we know, the Russians are producing thousands of them. They are way ahead of us on this schedule. A Patriot missile, by comparison, costs 5 million euros. So you're sending over something that each time you fire it, and generally Patriots, if you know anything about them, they're often fired in salvos of 2. So, but let's just say 1, 5 million a pop to try and shoot down a 50,000 euro drone. And of course, then you would say, well, the Patriots are used against the cruise missiles and the ballistic missiles. Well, as we know, what of course has come out is that the Patriots' success rate wasn't that good. I listened to Scott Ritter talk about the Patriots' actual use in the Gulf War, when the technology from what they were firing against were basically Iraqi Scud missiles. The Patriot wasn't really as effective as we were led to believe. Now we know for a fact that it cannot intercept things like the Orezhnik missile and Russia's other hypersonic Kinzhal missiles. So what exactly are these Patriot batteries going to do except chew up vast sums of money which Europe has to transfer from public funds into the American defense sector? Appalling. And as we talked about last week, I now see that we are in the opening stages of World War III. And it's interesting, a report came out at the end of last week, and I'll quote it to you because it came out, it was the French Strategic National Review. So this is an important document. It shows how the French government is viewing, and the French military is viewing, the future in Europe. And these are some of the quotes. Now, this is a direct quote. "We are entering a new era in which there is a particularly high risk of a major high-intensity war in Europe by 2030. We are being, as a collective, as a people, we're being schooled and basically pushed into an upcoming war. And people like Scott Morrison, who are drumming up fear about China, just so the bastard can get paid by defense companies and be on, junkets, by Lockheed Martin and the like. These people are risking all of our collective lives. We really need to be careful because, as I said last week, the parallels to today and pre-1914 Europe are striking. They're alarming. This warmongering, this increase in defence expenditure, and this, rather than looking for ways to stop wars, we continually look for ways to keep them going. Europe is doing everything it can to keep the war in Ukraine going. It's doing nothing to stop the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine could be stopped. It could be stopped tomorrow by some simple agreements to the realities of what's actually happened on the ground. Instead, we've got this illegitimate and dangerous guy, Zelensky, going on about getting, Ukraine's 1991 borders back, including Crimea. Complete farcical pie-in-the-sky stuff. And we're supporting that. And the new commander to NATO actually came out, the American commander, because of course the head of NATO is always an American. And he said the war in Ukraine can be won. Yeah, it can be. Yeah, but only by the Russian sport, if you know anything about what's actually happening over there. Now, the other thing that speaking of Russia, that the French Strategic Review said was that Russia poses the most direct threat to the interests of France and to those of her allies. Well, it does, Macron, if the interest of France is keeping a dictatorial, right-wing, neo-Nazi government in Ukraine, because if that's your interest, then Russia does pose the biggest threat to it, because they're going to dismantle it and they're going to end it. And as I've said before in this program, Zelensky's on his way out. That guy is on limited time. He's another Netanyahu. Both of them only have one goal in life: keep conflict going so that they stay out of jail or they stay in power. And they're both guilty of the same crime. Anyway, that's all. It's just a quick update on what's happening in the world. And unfortunately, it's all depressing again. But that's the truth. That's the reality. In Australia, free speech is a thing of the past. And we're heading headlong worldwide into the Third World War. And with, reports like what's just come out of France, it shows you the way the French, the Europeans are thinking. Old General Freuding, sometimes a missile is just a missile. He's, advocating sending long-range missiles to Ukraine. He's advocating maintaining that war. Why do you want to maintain wars? Isn't the idea to end them, to stop them? Okay, and if you know the reality, which is that Ukraine has lost well over 1 million men. The estimates are now up around 1.5 million dead. That country is being destroyed by a grubby little opportunist politician who wants nothing other to remain relevant and is bleeding his own country to death, rather than making it wouldn't be a great peace, but it's the best deal he's going to get. If he made it now, the war would end and a lot less Ukrainians and a lot less Russians would be alive in the coming years, would die in the coming years. Anyway, remember, as Bintang says, that's the problem in the world, is there are two types of people and you need to make sure you avoid them both. Have a good weekend. This Friday News Review saying, help.